Vespera stood as still as a statue carved from midnight, her eyes darker than the gaps between stars, tracking the way Kalen's fingers twitched toward her hand. She didn't flinch, she didn't move, but the air around her seemed to cool, a gentle pull on the ambient heat of the room that made the fine hairs on Kalen's neck stand up. He realized then that the silence between them wasn't empty. It was weighted with 42 years of her standing in a crowded room without a single shadow touching hers. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as anything other than a predator. The zenith was a monument to impossible architecture, a star-forged hub where the gravity felt just a little too light and the air smelled faintly of sterilized rain. Kalen had stepped off the transport ship 3 days ago, a novice envoy with a crisp uniform and a head full of Terran Union idealism. He was supposed to be a ghost, a quiet observer of the Great Unification Summit. His mentors had been very clear: watch the power players, ignore the outcasts, and for the love of Earth, stay away from the far corner of the South Pavilion. But humanity's greatest skill isn't technology. It's the stubborn refusal to see a monster where a friend is standing. Kalen had watched from a distance as the delegates of the Solar Coalition beings of light and hard edges steered their floating platforms wide of Vespera's booth. They whispered about soul leeches and the hunger of the Umbri. They spoke of a species that didn't just live in the dark, but consumed the light of others. Kalen ignored the warnings. It turned out that curiosity was a louder frequency than fear. He walked toward her booth on the second afternoon. The booth was draped in bioluminescent records that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic violet glow. When he got close, he didn't feel his life force draining. He just felt a strange, localized drop in temperature, like walking into the shade on a blistering summer day. Vespera had looked at him then, her long, elegant fingers tracing the edge of an ancient data crystal. She didn't speak. She waited for him to run. Instead, Kalen sat down. He listened as she began to describe the Umbri's true nature not as hunters, but as the galaxy's librarians. She explained the thermal harvesting mechanics of her people. They didn't steal life. They gathered the waste, the excess heat that every living thing bled into the universe. They were the ultimate recyclers, the keepers of the stories that everyone else was too busy to remember. In fact, the cost of fear is a galaxy of forgotten history, and as Kalen looked at the maps of star systems that had died out eons ago, he realized how much had been lost because no one wanted to sit in the cold with the Umbri. The scandal broke when they moved to the communal dining hall. Kalen chose the table directly across from the High Inquisitor of the Solar Coalition, and he invited Vespera to join him. The room went silent. The clatter of cutlery and the hum of 100 languages died instantly. Kalen could feel the High Inquisitor's gaze as searing, physical heat burning into the side of his head. But Kalen just smiled and offered Vespera a plate. He didn't understand yet that he was making an enemy of the most powerful faction in the hub. He only knew that for the first time in nearly half a century, an empress wasn't eating alone. The silence of the dining hall was merely the prelude. By the next cycle, the atmosphere in the great amphitheater had turned jagged. The High Inquisitor stood at the central spire, his form radiating a blinding rhythmic gold that made Kalen's eyes ache. He wasn't just speaking. He was presiding over a funeral for a future that hadn't even begun. The Sanctity Motion was a formal blade, a legal maneuver designed to excise the Umbri from the zenith like a tumor. The Inquisitor's voice boomed through the specialized translators, vibrating in Kalen's very marrow. He spoke of purity. He spoke of the inherent danger of a species that drank the warmth of the living. He painted Vespera not as an empress, but as a parasite hiding behind a veil of history. Kalen looked across the tiered rows. Vespera sat in the designated shadow-kin dock, her shoulders square, her face a mask of silver-pale glass. She looked ready to be hated. She had practiced this for a lifetime. When Kalen was called to the floor, the whispers were a physical weight. He was the primitive, the new blood, who didn't know the ancient terrors. He walked to the center of the forge, his boots echoing against the metal floor. He didn't look at the High Inquisitor. He looked at the hundreds of delegates who were leaning away from the dark. Truth is, we didn't come to the stars to repeat the mistakes of the dirt. Kalen's voice started thin, but grew as he looked up at the holographic displays. He talked about Earth. He talked about how, only a few years ago, humanity was the aggressive species, the one the galaxy whispered about in hushed, fearful tones. He described the cold terror of being the outsider. Then he signaled his team. Dr. Carter triggered the feed. A massive bioluminescent graph bloomed in the air, showing the real-time energy signatures of the Umbri. It wasn't a drain. It was a transition. The data showed that Vespera's people were absorbing the entropic heat, the literal waste of the station's life support, and stabilizing the local environment. They weren't leeches. They were the heat sink that kept the zenith from overheating. The High Inquisitor tried to interrupt, his light flaring, but the murmur in the crowd had changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the low, electric hum of a realization. Kalen turned to the assembly, his heart thudding against his ribs. He asked them if they were brave enough to admit that 1,000 years of history was a lie. He asked them if the Great Unification was a promise or just exclusive club for those who looked the same in the light. The vote was a blur of shifting colors on the overhead monitors. It was agonizingly slow. But as the final tallies locked in, the violet bars of the Umbri remained. The motion failed. The aftermath wasn't a celebration. It was a beginning. Vespera didn't offer words of triumph. Instead, she did something the Shadowkin had never done. She opened the bioluminescent records, the forbidden archives of 50 millennia, and invited the galaxy to read. She offered the cure for the galaxy's amnesia. Weeks later, the South Pavilion was no longer empty. It was the busiest sector of the hub. Kalen stood at the primary viewport, his new insignia as interspecies mediator, catching the light of the Star Forge. Beside him, Vespera watched a group of Solar Coalition scholars huddled over an Umbri data crystal. Their lights softened, their voices hushed in shared discovery. Vespera turned to Kalen. For the first time, she didn't just look at him. She leaned into his space, the air between them cooling to a comfortable, shared shadow. She didn't understand why her chest felt tight, or why this small, short-lived human had risked his world standing for hers. But as they watched the ships depart, she realized that the strongest weapon in the galaxy wasn't the light. It was the hand that reached through the dark to find another.